When we evaluate a civilizational project engineered by a divine figure, the expectation is success. So when we encounter a complete systemic collapse of that exact project, we have an analytical obligation to perform an autopsy on the failure. This investigation begins with a final anxious inspection. According to Jacob chapter 5, verse 38, the Lord of the vineyard and his servant descend to check on their isolated investments, explicitly traveling to the nethermost parts of the vineyard. In the historical context of the ancient Near East, the phrase nethermost parts designates the absolute furthest geographic reaches of the known ancient world. It is the end of the map. Placing ancient Israelite branches at these extreme coordinates was a deliberate strategy of geopolitical isolation. They were intentionally scattered and planted at maximum distance from their homeland to protect them from encroaching empires. The initial hypothesis driving this inspection is entirely logical. Placing a civilization in extreme isolation should theoretically preserve the integrity of the original, uncorrupted branch. The entire divine strategy relies on a single premise. It assumes that geographic separation from corrupting influences will ensure the preservation of a society. The reality on the ground destroys that hypothesis. In verse 39, the text details the devastating discovery. They had cast forth much fruit, and there was none of it which was good. Every single natural branch in the nethermost parts had become corrupt. The strategic isolation yielded a 100% failure rate across the board. The text emphasizes that the decay observed was total. This was a complete systemic compromise of the fruit, leaving zero viable yield from any of the scattered groups. The immense logistical effort of uprooting, transporting, and replanting these branches across the globe resulted in absolute uselessness. Because the failure was universal across multiple separate, distant locations, we can eliminate standard environmental variables like local climate or specific regional enemies as the primary cause of decay. The issue narrows to internal, systemic rot. Universal corruption proves geographic isolation alone is severely insufficient to mitigate civilizational decay. This forces a closer autopsy of the final, most tragic branch in the text. Zooming in on this final branch, verse 40 specifies the exact nature of the decay. The wild fruit of the last branch hath overcome that part of the tree which brought forth good fruit. Interpreters map these allegorical elements directly to historical subjects. The good fruit represents the initially thriving Lehi colony, known historically as the Nephites. The wild fruit represents their rival indigenous faction, known historically as the Lamanites. A shared civilizational origin point rapidly fractured into two fiercely competing societies occupying the same isolated geography. The ultimate historical outcome of this specific internal conflict was total eradication. The Lamanite faction completely annihilated the Nephite civilization in final wars. This destruction resulted from internal societal cannibalization. The wild faction physically overran the cultivated infrastructure, starving the remaining good root of its ability to produce. The reaction to this collapse is documented in verse 41. And it came to pass that the Lord of the vineyard wept, and said unto the servant, What could I have done more for my vineyard? Notice the psychological weight here. The text explicitly omits any display of divine wrath. The reaction is profound, helpless grief. That rhetorical question, what could I have done more, serves as an analytical starting point, inviting us to retroactively investigate every advantage granted to this branch. The Lord's grief signals that the maximum threshold of divine assistance had already been reached. There were no more interventions left to deploy. To answer the Lord's question, we must establish the autopsy parameters and document the exact physical and geographic investments made prior to planting. The tragedy is amplified precisely because the civilization collapsed despite the absolute exhaustion of divine resources. Verses 42 and 43 pinpoint the geographic location of the final branch, describing its placement in a good spot of ground that was choice above all other parts of the land. This animated map highlights the ancient Americas. As expanding rings indicate, thousands of miles of oceanic barriers provided severe topographical superiority, severing it from ancient warfare. Emerging bar charts show optimal agricultural density, priming it for rapid civilizational growth. This environment was engineered to serve as an uncorrupted incubator, entirely free from the external imperial threats that historically plagued Israel. Yet, the reality of the societal failure occurred directly inside this perfect geographic staging. Providing a civilization with the most optimal, geographically secure environment does not immunize it against self-destruction. The ultimate preparatory act is revealed in verse 44, where the Lord states he cut down that which cumbered this spot of ground, that I might plant this tree in the stead thereof. The term cumbered implies more than just natural growth. In the context of planting a choice branch in the stead of what was there, it suggests a total replacement of the previous occupant. This cumbrance refers to the Jaredites. Their civilization reached a point of total internal collapse just before Lehi's arrival, leaving behind a continent that was geographically cleared of any competing political or military infrastructure. The historical reality of the Jaredite collapse involved a total societal annihilation. Their internal wars left the continent vacant for the next inhabitants. This means the very soil the Nephites settled was prepared through the total extinction of a predecessor. The cost of their planting site was the end of an entire previous empire. Recontextualizing the Lord's grief against this massive preparatory cost reveals that the land was secured at the highest possible price. Because the ground was bought through the destruction of a previous civilization, the Nephites' failure represents a total loss of that immense investment. Verse 45 describes the chronological mechanics of the collapse, noting that, because thou didst not cast away the branches thereof, that they have overcome the good branch, that it hath withered. This animation shows the aggressive, suffocating speed at which the wild Lamanite faction's influence overran and crushed the remaining good roots of Nephite society. A severe paradox is hidden within the text. It was the Lord's own initial mercy, allowing both factions to grow together, that provided the wild branches the requisite strength to kill the good. An act of divine patience inadvertently armed the very mechanism of the civilization's destruction. Delaying judgment through mercy did not rehabilitate the wild faction. It ensured the complete extinction of the good. The sequence of investments given to this branch included absolute geographic isolation, optimal ecological conditions, and the historical clearing of the massive Jaredite empire. Despite operating within the perfect staging ground, the unyielding metric remains. The civilizational failure rate stayed at exactly 100%. This outcome indicates that environmental and geographic advantages are secondary to the internal choices of a society. The final branch demonstrates that you cannot engineer a geographic or ecological solution to a spiritual and systemic rot. The allegory of the vineyard proves that no amount of divine preparation, historical staging, or geographic isolation can override the destructive trajectory of human agency.